Words and names are powerful things. Fresh from the mouths of politicians, soldiers and commentators, the language of war can galvanise and terrorise, polarise and politicise. Like a military strategist uses technology and tactics to hide their true intent on the battlefield, when a conflict spills over into the field of linguistics on the home front, words and names are often employed to obfuscate and misdirect. In the arsenal of modern wartime vocabulary, the term collateral damage is a favoured weapon. It is a term used to sterilise an occurrence native to the war zone, civilian casualties. Today, I am joined by two authors whose respective works cover two very different wars, who have employed words not to conceal, but to illuminate. I'm Joey Catanzaro, I'm the defence writer for the West Australian, and I have the great privilege of welcoming you all to Collateral Damage. Kim Barker is an American journalist and former foreign correspondent for the Chicago Tribune. Her book, The Taliban Shuffle, is a personal account of her time spent reporting in Afghanistan and Pakistan. It's cheeky, it's raw, it's painfully honest, it's funny and it's heart-wrenching. Her often moving accounts concerning the death of civilians in both countries and the politics of collateral damage lurking in the wake of the body count serve as both a factual and emotional spotlight, an antidote to the anaesthesia of now familiar headlines from faraway places. Paul Ham is a Sydney-based historian with a swag of nominations and award-winning books under his belt. He's also the Australian correspondent for the London Sunday Times. His new book, Hiroshima Nagasaki, is arguably his best work yet. With brutal honesty and a superb commitment to detail, Mr. Ham's book tells the full story of the Allies' atomic attack on Japan in the dying days of World War II. He does not shy away from the hard truths that, almost 7 decades on, have either been forgotten, intentionally ignored, or passed over for their complexity. It is a good hard look under the mushroom cloud, and in a moment you'll hear some of his findings. Kim,
yes.
I wanted to start off with you if that's okay, and we'll get you to tell us a little bit about your book in just a minute, but first and foremost, in your book you do mention a point that you reach where you've been a foreign correspondent for a while and you begin to feel that Afghanistan had become not such a good war. Can you tell us about that?
Right. That would have been in June of 2006. I always talk about the idea that Afghanistan continues to be looked at as the good war as opposed to Iraq. Iraq was always the bad war, but people said, well, Afghanistan, we can understand why we're there and what we're doing there. Of course, I chronicled it during a time where things started changing, the Taliban started coming back, and you really had a sense that it was no longer a good war. You had people starting to rebel against the idea of the foreign troops being there. In Kabul, there was riots back in May of 2006 that took 4 hours to put down. They were saying things like death to Americans, death to Karzai, and all those sorts of things. I really saw everything that was happening at that time as a result of two different wedge issues that had developed in Afghanistan. One was corruption, and the profound corruption of the government there and of the Western community, taking in lots of money, living in great houses, having these incredible parties in Kabul, and I do chronicle these in the book. And the whole sense that everybody was getting something out of this war except for ordinary Afghans. The second major wedge issue, though, was civilian casualties. And the whole idea that, you would have a night raid, for instance, on an Afghan house, or a bombing of a wedding party where innocent people would be killed. And in Afghanistan, especially in the Pashtun areas, they are almost required by their code to react against that. There is a Pashtun proverb that is about this rivalry between these two fighting clans, where a guy waits 100 years after an insult done to his family to take revenge, and then he worries that he acted in haste. And this is a proverb, right? I always refer to it not as eye for an eye justice. It's more like 100 eyes for an eye. In other words, any single thing that happened there, you were creating 10 more insurgents that were going to go against you. And let's face it, collateral damage is always the term that's used for what the West does in those situations, not necessarily what the Taliban does. And I did feel it was interesting over the years watching the reaction of Afghans to these civilian casualties to this collateral damage on both sides, because it was inevitable that when the West did something, there would be a reaction, and people would complain about it, say the West needs to do a better job. Karzai would complain about it, but then you had the Taliban almost, with impunity, killing children, attacking schools, attacking girls, and you didn't have the same sort of reaction to what they were doing, which I always, and I think that you're still seeing that today.
Absolutely, and definitely want to get into that. Paul, I wanted to ask you a quick question as well. World War II, a very different war from Afghanistan, lacked even the pretense of paying lip service to winning hearts and minds. And as you stressed throughout your book, it was a war that was waged on a total scale. One of the more controversial elements, arguably woven throughout your book, is the fact that the Allies apparently deliberately targeted civilians during the war. Can you paint us a bit of a picture about the types of things that were done to that end and why they were done?
Yes, certainly. Thanks. Thanks for coming. The idea of collateral damage is not applicable really to my book, because this was not collateral damage; it was deliberate damage. There was a determined policy that took the war over Germany and over Japan to civilian life. Now, of course, the Germans and Japanese started this. You could say certainly did, but we took it back to them on a scale that the world has never seen, and it was a policy which we can actually date back to a book by an Italian general called Due, who wrote a book called The Command of the Air in 1918. And this was just when air power was making its emergence. And what he conceived of was a future war where the bombers flew over the heads of the poor old infantry on the ground, thrashing around in the trenches, and bombed the families at home, bombed the homeland, bombed the wives and the children. And this would be so demoralizing to both the soldiers, who would give up the candle, and also to the people at home, the survivors, who would then rise up and supposedly in an insurrection and force the government to surrender. This policy was applied in Japan in the last 6 months of the war, dating from March the 9th, 1945. And what we saw was an incendiary bomb developed to explicitly, and the minutes are all in the book, explicitly to lay waste, in other words, to burn down Japanese cities, which are of course made of, paper and wood. And they actually chose nights when there were particularly strong winds, which would act as giant bellows to the firestorms that would incinerate these cities. Now, before the bomb was even dropped, 66 Japanese cities were smouldering ruins. And the commander, General Curtis LeMay, boasted at the time that we have bombed, burnt, and incinerated more Japanese people than were subsequently killed in the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs. So you saw far greater casualties from the incendiary campaign against Japanese civilians. Now, we could say that this was, from this great distance, that who am I and who are we to sort of make a judgment about this? But people were making a judgment about it at the time. Eisenhower and MacArthur both regarded it as barbaric, and it was not militarily necessary. And the extraordinary thing is, when you look back, the prisoners of war who claimed to have been exonerated by the atomic bombs might have thought, not them, but their families subsequently, and I've spoken to many families of prisoners subsequently, they might have actually, had they known, and in fairness to them, they didn't know, directed their anger at a campaign against civilian life, which, to the sheer strategy, meant that they weren't destroying the Japanese war machine. And so by the end of July 1945, Japan still had in existence, for example, the kamikaze airfields in the southern island, which were used in Okinawa. They still had in existence the giant coal ferries going between the islands. They didn't have much coal, but they certainly had the ferries in place. They still had in existence all sorts of munitions factories, underground. This is extraordinary. So had we taken the war to their war machine, where it really would have hurt them, the war could well have ended earlier. So it was a completely misguided strategy which led to in excess of 500,000 Japanese civilian dead and 3 to 4 million homeless and displaced.
Incredible figures. Whether or not it's a deliberate strategy in modern terms, it certainly collateral damage still does obviously take place today, Kim. And you've obviously been there. You in terms of, say, this sanitised term, what does it really mean? From a personal perspective, you've witnessed some things that most of us thankfully never will. Can you paint us a bit of a picture?
Sure. The first time that I really experienced one of these collateral damage situations was with a man named Shayesta Khan. He was about 80 years old. He lived in a tiny little compound outside of the southeastern city of Khost in Afghanistan. And there was, the families in Afghanistan, they tend to live in these huge compounds, so you'll have 3 generations, 4 generations of families living together. And in this particular compound, there was about 50, 60 people who all lived there, all of the same family. Again, Shaya Sahan is about 80, give or take, because nobody in Afghanistan really knows how old they are. It's about 1 in the morning, and all of a sudden, there's, noise coming in from the outside, and all of a sudden, all these basically, U.S. Special Forces, accompanied by a few Afghans, come bursting in through the door of the compound, and they're just yelling at everybody, freeze, 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 pointing their guns. Allegedly, there is an Afghan translator there, but it's not sure. Everything's so confused. You have no idea who's where and where they're going into whatever compound. And Shaya Sahan was sleeping alone in a tiny little twin bed in a small little room where he had pictures of himself with his former communist boss on the wall and another picture of him and his wife, which is fairly unusual. And instead of coming into the room or doing anything else, there was a shout from the outside, freeze, freeze. You could tell this by where the bullet holes went. And here's this old man. Who knows what he was going for at this particular time? Some people say he was reaching for a nightshirt. Others say maybe he was going for a gun. He's 80. I tended to think that he was going for something to put on. All of a sudden, the gunfire came through the windows. You've got these scared kids on the U.S. side, most likely, and they don't know what he's reaching for, and they don't know necessarily that he's 80. But they riddled those windows in the inside of that particular room with bullets, and Shaya Sahan was killed. So I decided I wanted to go down there after this to sort of see what had happened and to see how it had affected this family. I had just been on an embed with the U.S. forces, and I always felt like it was really important as much as possible to see both sides of it. This case was the first time that Hamid Karzai actually spoke out against these night raids by U.S. forces. The first time he actually adamantly said that you are creating more terrorists in our country by doing things like this. And we went down there, myself, my driver, Nasir, and translator/fixer/local best friend, Farouk, to talk to these people in this family. And they welcomed us. That always strikes me, to say something like that. An Afghan welcomed an American into his home days after his son was killed, or days after the father was killed, and fed us and gave us tea and were willing to answer our very personal questions about how they felt about what had happened to Shaya Sahan. And Afghans, it always struck me as they almost weren't angry enough for me, There was always this sense that it's as if, inshallah, as God wills it. There was a sense of fate there, that if he died, it was as God willed. And so, therefore, what good does it do to complain that much? Yet they were obviously angry about what had happened to him. He was a man who had supported whatever regime was in charge during the various times in Afghanistan, and it wasn't anybody who was against what was happening in Afghanistan at the time. They searched the compound. They arrested 3 men. They found 1 AK-47 and 1 pamphlet talking against America, which actually in the South is a particularly low haul for weapons or for anti-American propaganda. And they talked to us, and we did a story, and the Americans insisted that they had done nothing particularly wrong. At that particular point, they had not decided whether to pay reparations and how to handle these civilian casualties or collateral damage. So instead, it was more like, let's just pretend it didn't happen, put out some press statements, and try to move on. We did find out later that at least 2 of the sons ended up turning to the Taliban, and other folks as well who were involved with the family as a way to try to take revenge against what had happened. That's one side of it. And I want to stress that the Taliban were capable of these atrocities, unlike what the West was doing, because the West, I think, never planned to do it. It was always like this accidental thing, whereas the Taliban would actually target things, and they would use children as suicide bombers. And just real quick, to be fair, I met this 13-year-old boy once in Kabul. He was being held in a prison because he had been arrested coming across the border, where he had been told, that he was going to, kill the infidel. Here was a boy who had never been to school. He had simply been to a madrasa in the tribal areas because that's all there was. And at this madrasa, he learned how to memorize the Quran, a book written in a language he didn't understand. That's what they do. They memorize it in Arabic, rocking back and forth. And he had to take what the cleric told him as the meaning of this book. And after he was finished, at age 13, the cleric said, "You are a very good Muslim. But if you're going to be a very good Muslim, you need to go across the border and take this bomb and kill the infidel. And if you're really a good Muslim, you won't die." And these are the sort of kids and these are the sort of folks that are being used to carry out the Taliban's idea of doing civilian casualties and collateral damage. And I always feel like in any of these discussions, it's important to talk about that as well.
Absolutely. I just want to move to you, Paul, just for a moment. You mentioned, and it might be interesting, Kim, if you want to jump in as well, sort of looking at this sort of thing from a modern prism, but you mentioned throughout the book how there was, I don't know if it was an intentional, but it seemed to me that you were suggesting it was an intentional move to dehumanise the Japanese civilian in the eyes of the public in the West.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it was a total racial war. There was no bones about it. Anyone who lived through it will remember the propaganda. The Japanese were the enemy. It wasn't about the military, the armed forces being the enemy. It was the Japanese people were regarded as the enemy in the eyes of the propaganda that was sold to the public. I mean, our own Prime Minister, John Curtin, used the hatred of the Japanese as a means of war propaganda. And Robert Menzies made one of his most dignified speeches in Parliament attacking this policy. How did it help us, he said, to demonise an entire race? The Australian soldier is a good fighter, but he's never been known as a good racist. This was Menzies. There were no votes to be won in that speech, I can tell you. And it is one of his most extraordinary statements. Very few people are aware of that. But whether you start from the basic training with blaming the actual manual of training for the infantry, where the Japanese were universally demonised as apes, as monkeys, as slant-eyed freaks, as a simian invasion. And then you work your way up through the US troops went into battle with, across their helmets, kill the Japs. It was all these sorts of slogans. I mean, it was ingrained in the training. But as you went up through the various levels, it seemed to get worse. I mean, Admiral Halsey was one of the greatest Jap haters of all time. I mean, he was known as saying that all sorts of extraordinary statements to his sailors that not only kill them but kill them in huge numbers and desecrate the bodies. But right up to the top, I mean, Churchill. One of the great white supremacists, and of course a great man, but used to refer to them as, "We shall kill those yellow dwarf slaves in great numbers." He never forgave them the loss of Singapore. So this was permeated the entire, and I have to say that on the Japanese side, the similar demonisation of the white Anglo-Saxon. We were called monkeys and barbarians and apes as well. They peddled stories in the Japanese papers about how we used to collect Japanese skulls and send them home to our families. I mean, it was the propaganda war was universally setting up the enemy as not just the armed forces, but the entire people. And of course, the Japanese war was waged for the express purpose of occupying the great hole left by the colonial forces. As the Dutch, the French, and the British withdrew, they were going to fill that gap. So this was a colonial war in the eyes of the Japanese, and the colonies were the enemy. The white man was the enemy. There was no, so no one, there was no one
hearts
pulling
and minds.
There were no hearts and minds to be won.
But what I'm sort of interested in, sort of hearing your thoughts on both your thoughts, is that so we see an intentional during World War II, an intentional blurring of the line between civilian and combatant, and as you say, a propaganda war being waged. In a modern context, in places like Afghanistan, are we sort of having had this background, this sort of cultural sort of memory as such of when this was the case? Are we now having trouble? And you are a journalist as well as a historian, Paul, so please feel free to jump in. I'm sure you've got your finger on the pulse.
Yeah.
Are we now having trouble distinguishing between who is the Taliban, who is a civilian? Are we just seeing them all as our troops from what you've seen and what you've read? Are they all just being seen as the enemy?
I mean, I think it's challenging, and I always try to put myself in the shoes of whoever I'm trying to write about. There you are, a very young, ignorant soldier, poor education. You might have gotten, a day of cultural training before you go into a very foreign place. And then you are kept inside a forward operating base. You get to go out occasionally. And I think the tendency with anybody is to see the other, to sort of define the other and to dehumanize the other. And even in a situation like Afghanistan, where we are technically supposed to be winning hearts and minds, and we're supposed to be, supporting the government, I think in some places it's more easy to see every Afghan as a Haji, every Afghan as a potential threat, as a towelhead, to do things like, urinate on the bodies of Afghan Taliban that you kill. To take souvenirs even. There was the kill squad out of Kandahar where they would kill folks, and some of them, it was just for fun, and they would take things like a pinky or something to mark that they actually, killed somebody.
Paul, it might be interesting to ask you this quickly. I'm curious. Was this a successful strategy, this propaganda war? Was it making it easier for troops on either side, do you think, to aim a rifle at somebody, another human being, and then shoot them? And are we, in a modern context, could you see how, if it was successful back then, how it might be difficult without this blanket of tacit approval of this is the enemy, it doesn't matter who you shoot?
It was certainly... I'm interested in what you're saying because, and it goes into what you're asking. I'm not reminded of Vietnam, because if you change the word Afghanistan for Vietnam there in your response, you have virtually the same response. Because in Vietnam, I wrote a fairly substantial book on it, and you had an enemy that no one could identify who they were, and whether this village, take a village, there were those who wanted to be neutral, didn't want to be part of the war. There were those who were loyal to Saigon, or supposedly loyal to Saigon, and there were those who were North Vietnamese loyal, or were Viet Cong. And the problem with the American war in Vietnam as fought, the tactics fed into a disastrous policy, because if they were fired upon from a village, they went and incinerated and ruined and destroyed the village. They might have flown over with a megaphone saying, all those we are going to destroy your village, please evacuate. They probably didn't say please. And the point I'm making is that they would then completely take out the village, and anyone who was possibly neutral or could have been transferred to the American side were automatically with Ho Chi Minh. So the US war as fought turned everyone into a North Vietnamese sympathizer or supporter. So the tactical war was the best kind of propaganda against America's interests. And if, as you say, is happening in Afghanistan, I can see all sorts of parallels. And certainly even the language, the euphemisms are disturbingly similar. We heard of Iraqization. Well, I mean, they were talking about Vietnamization in 1968. So the thing is being played out in a sort of... I also think it's just, you're handing guns to folks and you're telling them to go kill somebody, or to defend something, and you're being shot at, and you can almost see how it naturally happens to people, how you can turn into this kind of, this soldier that you never thought you would be before you went over there. I remember talking to folks in the beginning of their deployments versus the end, and the language they would use, and how they would almost have to justify how they had behaved, to make themselves somehow be able to sleep at night. Yes, and fitting to your point about did it make it easier for them to shoot? Because you have a close guerrilla war, an insurgency war in Vietnam and in Afghanistan, and as I understand it, in Afghanistan the Americans have learned something from Vietnam, and they understand counterinsurgency tactics, whereas in Vietnam they had no idea, and it was a disaster. But the close proximity of the war meant that it was there's a book called On Killing, and it says that most men, if they've got an enemy soldier, they don't line up and shoot. Most men can't do it. That's why they have machine guns, which makes it easier, because you can't see the enemy. But when you have very high semi-automatic rifles, which are highly accurate, you are lining up human beings to be shot, and most human beings can't do this. This is the theory of On Killing, and he's done incredible research. What people would do would be to turn away or to target elsewhere. But there are a core group in any army that will kill. But then they had to get over this reluctance of people, of men, to kill each other by casting all the gooks as enemies. So that you were blinded to them as human beings. You were programmed to think of them as monkeys or monsters, or particularly in the case of Japan, of course.
And I think in modern warfare, we're really seeing this interesting switch right now that needs, obviously it's going to need some study, and folks are already talking about it, which is the use of drones in warfare, where you can actually sit in Nevada and, you know, people say it's like a video game, it's like a very sophisticated video game, and you're just having to operate a system where you're targeting this particular person. You don't have to be there. You don't even have to be in the sky. How impersonal is that? And now with the spread of drones, I think that it's going to be, you know, very interesting to see what happens. Not necessarily a good thing.
You actually mentioned in your book, Kim, one particular incident where you're sitting, I think, with some American soldiers, you know, some sort of command point as such.
They were really thrilled I was there.
And I'm sure they were. And you hit upon something interesting just for everybody that's here today who I'm presuming predominantly are Australian. I mean, we have a very similar system whereby when there is an incident, the Defence Force will put out a press release. There may not be a lot of detail for the media, and our questions may not be answered in full. Sometimes the answers don't come up, and maybe in 70 years' time we'll have somebody like Paul come and write a fantastic book that's going to answer some of the unanswered questions about Afghanistan. But the point I'm trying to make is that you're in this situation where you're watching these American soldiers. They're actually, I believe it was an aerial bombardment of some kind, and they missed. Is that right?
Well, what happened, I was in Helmand, in a new little fob called Musa Khala, which was essentially 200 U.S. soldiers that had been sent in there pretty much a week or two before I got there. And it was really the first time that the U.S. or anybody had gone into Helmand in the south. So this is June of 2006. It was really when they started getting a sense of how strong the insurgency was. And they saw some insurgents. They attacked a U.S. patrol that was up the road. So they called in a drone, and the drone went there and followed, you know, the folks as they went back into this compound. And then they got permission to do a strike. This was one of the drones, a Predator, that did not have a bomb attached to it. So they actually had to send in a B-2 with a 500-pound bomb. Always seemed a little bit overkill in Afghanistan, since most of the buildings actually are made of mud. So there I am in the control room where I'm not supposed to be. I mean, specifically as a journalist, you're not supposed to be there where they're doing these sort of attacks, but it was very freewheeling, and it was a small base, so they said, yeah, why don't you watch the video? And so they're all sitting around this table, and they're watching this video, and the video is of this particular compound. And then, you know, they drop the bomb, and everybody's kind of like, yay, you know, and there's sort of this cheer that goes up. And then the bomb hits, and the dust clears, and everybody's like, oh, no, you know, because it clearly did not hit the compound at all. It was, you know, 100 yards away or so, a couple hundred yards away. And, you know, there's somebody very quietly who just says, they missed. And then everybody just turns and looks at me, you know, like the journalist in the room. And I'm just sitting there, and they, to their credit, let me stay. And they called in, and they had to get approval again to do another, you know, bombing run, and that took another couple hours. And then they actually did hit the compound, at which point I was gone. But it does get at the whole idea of Afghans. When they would sit there and see something like this, they didn't believe it. They felt like the technology of Americans is such, and I heard this across the country, they could hit a target within 3 inches. So therefore, if you're hitting something that's that far away, most definitely you're doing it on purpose. So they would feel like any time one of these drone attacks or these bombs led to civilian casualties, that it was something that we were trying to do on purpose.
And Paul, I mean, in your book, obviously, aerial bombardment is a method of warfare. We're talking about a different scale in terms of casualties back then, but is this a sort of a frightening evolution, perhaps, of what you were sort of talking about during World War II?
Well, you could, if you link the two stories, you could say that technology should have given us the power to strike something within 3 inches and to try to avoid civilian casualties. That was the justification for area bombing and strategic bombing, as they called it, over Japan and Germany, that we didn't have the radar, the technology to, in fact, strike military targets, factories. That wasn't true. I mean, as the war wore on, they did actually develop the technology to be able to do it, because D-Day couldn't have gone ahead without without Allied bombers destroying the German railways and supply depots in France at the time. And that was the real reason why D-Day succeeded, is that they cut off Germany's opportunity to actually get to the beaches. The railways were destroyed. So this was an absolute lie. I mean, they could actually pinpoint targets, but they chose not to. And the reason they justified it by saying, we will destroy the morale of the enemy by taking out their entire cities. Now, they had empirical evidence that this doesn't work, and we all know where that came from. It was the Blitz over London. I mean, that didn't destroy British resolve, that fortified it. And the same thing happened in Germany and Japan. It fortified Japanese and German resolve to withstand it. Now, leading through history, I mean, yes, so we've got far better technology, which should give us the power to just target the enemy's military machine and try to avoid civilians. And collateral damage, to give it the benefit of the doubt, is supposed to be collateral. We're not supposed to be aiming for them. So in other words, you could argue that war has become immensely civilized since 1945, where there was no pretense that this was collateral. This was, as I've said, deliberate wasting of entire cities.
Has the war become incredibly civilized?
I mean, look at what happened in Afghanistan in the 1980s, right? You had an entire system that was where you would leave, on either side, they would do this, pens in certain areas, dolls in certain areas, designed to maim, not to kill, so that a child would pick one of these up and it would explode and they would lose a hand or a leg or their eyesight or something, thereby taking not just a child out but a potential fighter. And you had this on both sides, and you had this still continue to happen during the early 90s. Now, since then, I would argue that the West has tried to do a better job of minimizing civilian casualties than necessarily the Taliban, but the Taliban is most definitely still using that tactic, hurt the kids.
Absolutely. The Taliban seem to be much more savvy at exploiting the politics of so-called collateral damage.
Yes, very savvy. They speak the local language. They also speak the language of fear. You're an Afghan, you're in a village, and all of a sudden the Taliban come riding in the night when there's no Western forces there, and they tell you, you're going to shelter us, you're going to give us food for the night. What do? I mean, I know what I'd do. I'd feed them. I'd give them shelter. And then the Taliban will, in essence, use these civilians as their own sort of shields.
Again, this is Vietnam rewritten.
Yeah.
This is a repeat of history.
It is.
I mean, they'd go into a village in Vietnam, they'd say, you're going to support us. The Viet Cong would go into a village and say, you support us, or we'll give you food and things, or they'd try to bribe them, and then if they refuse, they would then threaten them, and if they still refuse, they would start killing the head man. There's a chapter in my book called The Hamlet Without a Soul, which the Australians built and resettled the people from one strategically important village to this built village, which was like a suburb in a typical Australian city. And Vietnamese villages are circular around a sort of common in the middle. And this village was block-like, with a grid. So no one wanted to live there, but they were forced to live there. And the hamlet chief was decapitated because it was seen to be the Australian village. And then the second hamlet chief was decapitated in the night. And this went on, and no one then would be hamlet chief, obviously. And then it became deserted in ghost town. And then the Australian soldier who I interviewed about this described it as a hamlet without a soul. This was going on. That example is unusual, but the resettlement of villages was going on all over Vietnam, and with a complete lack of understanding about how the people felt about it.
I do want to ask you something just specific to your book, Paul, if I could. It's sort of a bit of a controversial but well-supported claim that you say that the decision to use the atomic bomb on the Japanese was premeditated. It had been thought out well in advance, it seems, from my reading of your book. It seems to be a given that even without dropping the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the war would have ended, the Japanese would have lost, but it was a matter of when. And given that the Allies had actually suffered some incredibly heavy casualties, do you think, was it justified? Was there any sort of justification for dropping the bomb to end the war quickly so that nobody else died in the interim?
This is a huge question.
No, I'm playing devil's advocate.
The book answers it, and we don't probably have time, but
Sure.
I will give it my best shot very briefly.
Absolutely.
The bomb was militarily unnecessary. Now, that is not me saying that. That is the views of, where do we start? MacArthur viewed it as militarily unnecessary. Eisenhower viewed it not only as militarily unnecessary, but absolutely barbaric. Admiral Ley Chief of Staff to Truman, believed it was barbaric and militarily unnecessary. I mean, how many people do you need to draw on to tell us that our popular wisdom about the bomb is utterly false and we've been fed an American fable for the best part of 70 years? 2 years after the bomb fell, there was an article in Harper's Magazine which was written by the War Secretary Henry Stimson, or in his name, which said the bomb was justified because it avoided a land invasion of Japan and saved 1 million American soldiers. Let's just take those 2 points. There are many other things he said as well, but we won't deconstruct it to that point. But the land invasion was shelved in early July for the reasons that they could not tolerate the body bag count that they would have from an invasion of Japan. They'd seen the evidence on the wall with the Okinawa. They'd seen what would happen. President Truman could not tolerate those sorts of casualties, and so he shelved the invasion whether or not the bomb worked. All right? So then they knew that Japan was effectively defeated. It was landlocked by the American Navy. American Air Force had complete supremacy of the skies, and thank God for Admiral Halsey, who started to attack military targets at the end of July. So he was taking out the kamikaze airfields, the Honshu coal ferries, and all the military infrastructure at last. So the land invasion was shelved, and the Russians were urged to come in. So they were relying on the naval blockade, air supremacy, and the Russians. It gets complicated, and I'm not going to go into the complexity of the Russian involvement. But I will just say this,
Absolutely.
that the figure of 1 million saved is an extraordinary embellishment of the facts. At no time were 1 million men even going to go into Japan. The total was 700,000. Now, if you have 1 million dead, as you know, you have 3 million casualties. Because for every one dead, there's usually 3 or 4 wounded or missing in action. 3 or 4 million American casualties from the land invasion of Japan. This was a complete fabrication. This was trotted out 2 years after the war as the orthodox history. So in other words, Truman is making a virtue of a necessity which was never a necessity because it was shelved. Did it end the war? The Russian invasion, combined with the complete collapse of the Japanese economy, combined with the total air and naval supremacy of the Americans, ended the war. But the thing that tipped them over the edge on 11th of August, 2 days after Nagasaki, was the gift of their one condition, which was the emperor's life and the imperial dynasty, which we gave them on the 11th of August. That's all they wanted. They were saying that for months before the bombs were dropped.
Paul, we've had you comment on Afghanistan. I'm going to sort of turn back to Kim and get you to comment on what Paul's saying for a moment. They used a very interesting term. It was an American fable, and I just want to ask you about that because I'm not a very nice person, and get you to just talk about whether or not you think that in modern day America. I don't. Absolutely not. I just want to know, do you think that is true? Is there a perception in America, in modern day America, that dropping the bomb was the only course of action or the best course of action?
You know, embarrassingly enough, it's just difficult to say. I think it depends on where you live. If you live in the cities, you think it was a mistake. It just seems like that many lives would be a mistake. There's been plenty of movies such as The Fog of War, anything that's looked at what happened, the firebombing of Dresden or of Japan, and then the nuclear bomb afterwards, or the atomic bomb that actually took, I guess, fewer casualties than the firebombing, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
And, looking at all that in total, people say, God, that loss of life, it's a horrible thing. It was not a good thing to drop the atomic bomb. But if you go to more rural areas, there are 2 Americas at this point. I've visited one of them recently, and I believe they feel like it was a good thing, that it also led to the nuclear age, and it was important for America to develop that technology first.
And let's just put the Japanese point of view across, because that's what's interesting. The big 6 samurai warlords who were running Japan at the time didn't give a toss about civilian casualties. They didn't care. The bomb landed on Nagasaki, and they were having a meeting that morning in their shelter underneath the Imperial Palace. 6 men in their white ties, dressed up to the nines, and they're debating not the bombing of Hiroshima. This was 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima. They were debating the Russian invasion of the country the day before. And in comes a little runner, a messenger, bows low, says, "Sir, Nagasaki has been taken out by a special bomb." They didn't know it was atomic. There was no footage of this. There was no television or photographs. There was just American pamphlets saying, we've nuked you. So this guy says, well, Nagasaki had been hit by a special bomb. And the big 6 go, well, thanks, mate. Run along. We've got more important things to deal with, like the Russian invasion.
Mate.
I got the minutes translated of this meeting. The samurai did not care about Americans attacking their civilians.
You mentioned, it was interesting at the time, very different, the juxtaposition between the 2 wars, no photographs, no film footage as such. Now we do have those things. Do you think, I mean, the fact that generally speaking, the public, occasionally, journalists such as yourself do bring back to the West some of the things that are happening in terms of
the atrocities.
Atrocities is one word that you could use, but do people care? Do the public care? I'm being honest. I'm playing devil's advocate again.
No, I
It's not one of our boys, but
no,
do people care? Do you think they do?
Again, I think it depends on how you tell the story as a journalist, and it depends on the reader. My view in any of this, whether it was a suicide attack by the Taliban or a so-called collateral damage from an American attack or bomb, that it was my job to translate these folks back home as if they were your neighbors. You would tell the story of them as if they could be anybody that person knew. And I think those stories can be very effective. When you tell the individual story that illustrates the larger picture as opposed to just using a body count. I mean, you hear 140 people were killed in Karachi, Pakistan, at a bombing of Benazir Bhutto's homecoming. That doesn't, I think a number like that doesn't really resonate as much as telling the individual stories of who went there and what happened to them. It's almost like our minds can't comprehend 140, let alone how many people died.
But the classic example, the My Lai massacre. I mean, in Vietnam, 508 civilians, women, children and old men, deliberately exterminated over a whole day. I mean, the American GIs broke for lunch and resumed the killing. It was a determined policy to destroy this town, this village. But the interesting thing about the My Lai massacre is that no one in Vietnam, none of the journalists were interested, because their editors said, no one gives a toss about, a few more gooks dead. No one gives a toss about civilian dead. Why do you want to tell us about that story?
I think
so
that
it didn't even get covered.
It's much, and it eventually got covered. But it's much different now, just because our news is also so immediate. A video, say, of American soldiers who have an SS flag behind them. Everybody sees that right away now. The video of soldiers urinating on tops of corpses. They see that now. There's an immediate reaction back in around the world and in Afghanistan. I mean, right now you've got the obvious case of the fact that yet another Quran has been burned, and there's riots now across Afghanistan that have spread into Pakistan, and folks are dying because of that. Because, I mean, let's face it, folks over there do care. If you insult their religion at all, it's going to have much more of an effect than any of these civilian casualties. I mean, you didn't see the level of reaction to, say, the urination video that you are seeing right now to the idea that the Quran was burned.
So, can a war like Afghanistan be one when you've got a situation where you have foreign troops who they're facing the politics of collateral damage and various other factors on the ground? They're being used, exploited by the Taliban, or used by the Taliban, you might even say. And then on the other hand, there's this sort of back home, perhaps there's a backlash whenever there is an incident, whether it's intentional or not. Is it possible? I mean, World War II, it was a different sort of situation for the troops. They kind of had it was open slather as such. Now it's not. Do you feel sorry for the troops at all? I'm curious.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you can hear that whenever I'm talking, and especially when you would go on embeds with them, and they're these young kids, and they don't know anything, and they really don't have any choice but to view these folks, again, as the other, who might put the bomb there, who are shooting at them. And there are these rules of engagement in Afghanistan at this point where you just can't fire a gun at anybody who might have just fired at you. There are very, very strict rules of engagement for those sort of firefights, as opposed to whenever they decide to do a night raid or a drone strike. It's different rules of engagement with those particular cases. But to go back to your question, can this war be won? I mean, what does winning this war mean? I mean, how do you define that success? It seems to me that over the last more than 10 years in Afghanistan, there have been all these different goals, all these different definitions of what it means to win this war, and we've never come up with a coherent plan for that. I mean, there's not been one 10-year war fought in Afghanistan. It's been 10 one-year war, and the goalposts seem to be continually shifting. And at this point, winning the war is simply leaving. And that's what's happening by the year 2014, and that's what's considered to be winning it, to get everybody out.
So I just want to ask you both quickly, again, playing devil's advocate, is there ever a time when civilian casualties in war are justified?
Well, it's not. The question seems to me that they're inevitable, and how do you therefore minimise that inevitability? But I don't think what isn't justified is the deliberate slaughter of an entire people, which is what we saw in the Second World War. The problem with the Second World War, which makes it so difficult for me, is that I do believe there's such a thing as a just war. I don't think World War I was a just war. It was just a couple of imperialists thrashing it out in Europe over their claims to colonies, and with the slaughter of so many innocent young men and women and civilians. But the Second World War, in its global sense, is a just war. We were fighting against two obvious aggressors who were intent on exploiting and taking over great swathes of the world. But then you have to look at, what about our strategy and our tactics? Were they just? Is it just to use these tactics against civilians?
Kim?
And of course they're not.
Kim,
I agree completely with what Paul's saying. You can come up with sort of individual episodes that it seems like they would be justified. You've got Hitler, for instance. You've got Osama bin Laden. It's difficult to say that people would cry a lot if there's collateral damage or civilian casualties when it comes to a strike like that. But I always like to caution that any time there is one of these drone strikes, even when they're killing folks in Pakistan, because we've gotten very good at killing these folks in Pakistan and in Afghanistan at the same time, you've seen no lessening of the insurgency. In fact, they're even stronger than ever. And I think you do have to ask yourself about why that is.
I want to ask you very quickly, I'd like to move on because this is a writers' festival and perhaps there might be some people in the audience who'd like to hear about your writing process. But Kim, there is one story I wanted to just quickly pick your brains about, Kim. The taxi driver who was held in Guantanamo Bay came out back in Afghanistan, didn't seem to harbour any bitterness or ill will towards the Americans, considering his experiences, until the incident of the civilian casualty. Can you tell us about that?
Shayesta incident, actually.
And was he sort of maybe a bit of a weather vane?
He was a bit of a weather vane, but it's always difficult with Afghans in Afghanistan, because one thing that you learn the longer that you're there as a reporter is folks there will tell you what you want to hear or what they think that you want to hear. In many cases, they don't want to offend you. 30 years of war, you never want to say the wrong thing, whether it's to a journalist or a leader or anybody else. So this particular man, he was a taxi driver that everybody agreed should never have been sent to Guantanamo. It was one of these tribal rivalries. He's picked up back in fall of 2001 and sent off to Guantanamo. And then he was released in March of 2003, held for that long in Guantanamo for basically a mistake.
And he didn't seem to be particularly bitter.
Yep, he was released. I met him at the jail. It was one of my first assignments in Afghanistan. He gave me the money that was left over because they had kept his money and it was worth nothing at that point. So he gave me his Afghani and invited me to come visit him at his town outside of Khost. So I did. I went down there, and he was so full of joy to show me, his tapes that he had and had been hidden during the Taliban, his music player, the fact that he loved the movie The Titanic, and the whole family was just thrilled to have me there. And he seemed to bear no ill will towards the U.S. And I kept trying to pressure him, you must dislike us a little bit, and I would have my translator get him away from me and see if he'll say anything negative, and he just wouldn't. I met him then a few years later, actually at the circus in Kabul, and it was in the summer of 2006, shortly after there was a series of these civilian casualty incidents, including the Shayesta Khan one, which happened at a nearby village. And he was so cynical about everything that had happened, and for me represented really this feeling of hope and optimism that was at the beginning of the occupation there, because believe it or not, they wanted us there, and many of them still do, because it's preferable to the alternative. But then this whole idea of this disillusionment, this feeling that this great chance had been lost, and he really epitomized that.
Paul, a final question for you before we move on to the writing process as well, and perhaps you're very well placed to answer this. What have we learned since World War II, and what lessons have we failed to learn in terms of looking at through the prism of modern conflicts?
I'm not sure that we actually do learn. And, it'd be nice if politicians might just, say ever so humbly, learn the history. Because you see so many repetitions not so much in Afghanistan, but to a larger extent in Iraq.
Very much in Afghanistan.
But in Iraq even more so, of the failure to engage with the local people. I mean, this is the lesson from Vietnam. What do we learn from World War II? Well, we certainly learned from World War II that faced with a couple of two insane regimes, that to defeat it, you really do need to throw everything at it. But that will lead to an excess, or an enormity of excess that the world has never seen before, and hopefully will never see again. Because for a democracy to destroy a tyranny, the popular wisdom was that we have to go further than the tyranny, because they can enslave their people. We can't. So we need to adopt measures and tactics which absolutely overwhelm them. And that was the thinking. And it took us down a path which, I think, it was unconscionable. And it's not me saying that again. It's various commanders at the time, and certainly Eisenhower, he's an interesting case. But I think it was it debased ourselves. What happened in that campaign? I think it debases human civilization if we accept that Japanese atrocities warranted an American atrocity in reply. We talk about tooth for a tooth. America has the power to scatter 1 billion molars. And how are we going to use those?
Let's just move on quickly. I mean, it's fascinating to talk to you guys all day, but we want to keep some time for questions. A very succinct, give us a little bit of an idea about how you each sort of like to write, what's involved in the process. Very, very different books.
Well, for me, you outline, anytime you're doing a longer story or a book, you have to outline as painful as that procedure is. And then I almost feel like, I have something written in my head already, and it's just forcing myself to sit down and let it come out. I write in a very stream of consciousness fashion. I write best in the morning. I get up 6 a.m., and I can only write till about 1, and then after that would be revision. Always going back, trying to find the cliches. I feel like that's one of the things as a writer it's very important to do, to not use cliches, and every time I see one it drives me crazy. But I wrote this book in I think...
This book?
This book. I wrote this book in I had 7 months to write it, and I think I procrastinated about three of those months away, and wrote it in about 4 months. I was doing 7,000 words a day, but it's, again, I need to be almost up against a deadline and have a sense of what I want to say.
Paul? Oh my gosh, 7,000 words a day. I've never done 7,000 words a day.
I'm not saying they're good words.
Kim's a very personal...
Coherently put together words in sentences.
There's an incredible amount of research that's obviously gone into yours. You've drawn together a lot of different sources. How do you do it?
Well, you've got to banish, as far as possible, the benefit of hindsight as you start. And you've got to clear out the furniture in your brain, and then gather evidence and repopulate it, so that you're learning the story almost from scratch. That's obviously impossible, but you try to get rid of the popular wisdom, the preconceived notions, all the ideas you think happened, and then rebuild the whole story from scratch with your research. So it does take an immense amount of research, and I spent 2 months in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. I spent a month in the Truman Library in Missouri. I went from Sydney to Tokyo on a boat full of about 100 survivors of the atomic bomb, and interviewed 30 of them. And then you read everything you can in the time available. It takes 3 years to put a book like this together. And
very different books.
They're very different books. And finally you sit down and write. But you have, through that, you've constructed the edifice or the scaffolding of the book. And so each chapter is there already. They're movable feasts, of course. And then you have all your references. And in one chapter, for instance, I had 40 pages of references, which has to be condensed, synthesized into 5,000 words. To me,
it was really interesting having this idea, because it's my first book of 100,000 words you can do anything with, right? It seems like that's so much, but when you come down to it, it's so small.
It's so small.
And you've almost got to you have to know the narrative arc that you want. You have to know the story you want to tell. You have to know, for instance, that I was going to be the microcosm of American failure, therefore I had to be awful in many parts, and that Farouk was the microcosm of Afghanistan and what happened with that. And then you have to eliminate the extraneous stuff, which is almost the hardest part.
Yes,
everything's got to hang from, as you were saying, that scaffolding.
2 very different books, of course, 2 very different wars. Both are very good. If you're interested in getting either of the books or having the copy signed, I believe these guys will be over at the Festival Bookshop very shortly. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Okay.